And the core of contextual design starts with getting the right data. And it is qualitative data. When I said go out into the field and talk with people about what they do while they're doing it, this was not done. There might have been some anthropologists looking at things, but it was certainly not part of the practice. And so when you ask the question, where did your ideas come from? Sometimes I'll go, well, how can I answer that? I've been doing, in one form or another, qualitative research, understanding human behavior and experience since I was 10, watching all the kids dating and giving them coaching advice. So, I've been speaking from a stage from the time that I'm 13. So these, there's a certain amount of stuff that comes natural. Probably the first qualitative formal research I did was in my child psych class when I was observing little 3-year-olds pretending to be bats and understanding what was going on in the social dynamics, working also at the same time on application or implication. So from a qualitative research perspective, what we look for, what we care about is what's the question? What's going on in a phenomena? Some phenomena catches our mind, catches our interest. We say, oh my goodness, what's going on? That's not real different than when I said, wow, what's going on with retaining women in tech, right? Because we didn't understand it. There was no research on it. And so there's a big question that starts. And then we have to say, well, how do we understand it? How do we get the data? What does it mean about the lives? And then how to improve them. So we need to kind of go back into the 70s and the 80s and understand that the state of understanding lives was trifold. When we learned, even in psych class, we learned philosophy issues. We learned what the psychology had to say. We learned what did it mean for parenting or change or what have you. Always we were thinking about what are the philosophical implications. So remember, this was a time of protests in the Vietnam War. We were challenging everything. And what I was attracted to is our researchers like Piaget, who observed children and looked for patterns, Freud, who observed his patients, Erickson, who observed their folks, and Einstein, who used measurement to observe phenomena in the world. And what we produce are frameworks, ways of understanding, ways of saying, hey, I can give you some new glasses, some insights about the phenomena. And with these new glasses, we can see some new things. And that may lead us to further research, as was the case. So qualitative research, which in our field now we would think of as foundational research in the phenomena that you're trying to explore. What's happening with people and their finance, for example? What's going on in the business of, supporting accidents and claims and insurance policy? What's happening when people think things are cool? When we did our What Makes Things Cool project. So when we get those answers, it tells us what to do about design. So this was what I was doing back in the day. And then I went off to look for a job. Okay, so this was in the 80s. It was a downturn. There were literally no jobs in applied psychology in the whole country. There was not one single thing that you could get. I started working in a small college, and I was like, well, is this going to be it? It was great for having small children, but now what? So I went and I talked to somebody, and they said, well, you could work in human resources, but they won't give you any credit for your doctorate. You can work in, this other thing. You could work in tech. Tech is kind of rising, and they don't require you to get dressed up. So I really like the idea of not having to get dressed up at the time, although I'm known for my hats and dressing up. But at the time, that was quite attractive. And it turned out that in 1986, they held the 4th Computer Human Interaction Conference in Boston, which is where I lived. And so I'm now walking into this, and I'm like listening to this stuff, and I'm going, okay, you're talking about testing how good something is. You're using sort of, psych already took hard science methodology and turned it into psychology, because it's very different to understand what's happening with gravity and things than it is to understand human behavior and experience. And then cognitive psychologists who are now, encoders were adapting psych techniques, and that was the initial beginning of usability. Now, so I walk into this, nothing seems very interesting to me until John Whiteside gets on the stage. Now, John Whiteside was at Digital Equipment Corporation, and that was where I worked, my very first job. And he was sitting there talking about Terry Winograd and Fernando Flores' book, Understanding Computers and Cognition, and they were talking about phenomenological research. They were talking about qualitative research. They were talking about the idea that the person participates in the understanding. And I was like, are you kidding me? I gave up on that because, I come out of a phenomenological background. We'll talk about that in a little bit, what it means. And I couldn't even believe it. So I reached out to John Whiteside, and we kind of made up a postdoctoral internship. And I went to Digital in the Sioux Group, which was there at the time. And they were asking big questions. How do we go beyond tail end testing, Jonathan? How do we find out what we ought to be building for the user? And I was like, well, why don't you go talk to them? Why don't you go out into the field and talk with people while they're using their products? And that was like unheard of. And of course, remember, everybody's a developer at this time. There is no design. There's no, user experience. There's no user research. There's none of that, okay? And so I was like, wow, okay, here's a question. I can do this question. So the very beginning of Contextual Inquiry started at Digital Equipment Corporation, and its raison d'être is to figure out what we ought to be building, which for me meant let's go understand the people who are using it, okay? So if we think about designing a practice or anything, we need to have a challenge. We have to start with a big question, and that's going to guide us as we go along. And all of the changes in contextual design have come about because of changes in the population, in the way we do things, which challenges and still leads us to the question, how do we figure out what we ought to be building? All right. So contextual inquiry, the field interviewing technique, was the very first step in the process. And now we're going to go take a little tour with some stories, and we're going to look at how things evolved a little bit. All right, so let's talk about contextual inquiry. I said I was going to talk about ethics, origins, and diversity. And the ethics issue came first and then drives all the way through contextual design in contextual inquiry. So contextual inquiry says, just to remind you, go out into the field in a one-on-one field interview, about 2 hours. You're going to get detailed information or observation about the practice that is your target for your product. And we are going to do it through a combination of observation and discussion, not just observation, but observation and discussion. This is at the core of the contextual interview. And yes, these days, I'm going to write a new little monograph on remote CD. Yes, you can do it remotely. It's not as good. You should still be in the field. So, all right, so that's contextual inquiry. So the question is, where did it come from? Well, contextual inquiry is guided by 4 basic principles. The first principle is context, which says, go to the user, see the activity in situ. All right. Any kind of qualitative research, you have got to make your observations. So in this case, we need to go to the user. We need to see it in situ. And the very first paper I was ever an author on was with Whiteside Bennett, another mentor of mine, John Bennett. And they were writing about usability metrics because they were trying to measure stuff, okay? But the idea of context really appealed to them because I said, if you put people in a lab under conditions that you control, that's not going to be their natural interaction in the task or with the product. And this was surprising to them. And so in that paper, we wrote about the power of natural context versus a lab situation, which is at the core of looking for things that are going to be new as opposed to just fixes to what already exists. But contextual inquiry also has 3 other principles that tell you how to get the data. And this is driven by the ethical issues that emerged, during my education and what was going on. And so let's take a look at this. All right, so back in the day, back when I was in undergraduate school, there was no such thing as IRB. There was no such thing as caring about how we treated people when we were doing our research. The Milgram studies were asking people to shock people in the other room without any concern about what it was doing to the person who was doing the shocking. In that kind of a situation, somebody volunteers to be in the study. They put themselves under the control of the experimenter, and so they have effectively abdicated their power. It's very hard for them to say they don't want to do that anymore. Or how about the Stanford prison studies that did major damage to the people that participated, where people said they would be guards or they would be prisoners and took on the personas and did abusive things to each other. So I was doing research with kids. I was doing research with people. We were studying. Now, I learned about this in my psych classes because we were studying about how not to treat people. Now, one of the things we have to be cognizant of is that words matter. So if we call people subjects in our research, what we really mean is we are going to subject themselves. We are going to take power and subject them to our conditions. Well, of course, as soon as someone says, I will be part of whatever you said because I want to be a good guy, they have put themselves under your control. But that means that they're not kind of doing what they would naturally do. And if their environment, their context is also artificial, you're not going to be getting reliable data for how a product will work in the field. Remember, we're talking about product design here. All right, now at that time, we always read philosophy. Philosophy always guided us. Philosophy, psychology, sociology, application to practice. All right, this was what it meant to be educated back in the day. So I was reading Martin Buber's I and Thou, amongst other things. And I like this stuff. And so what does Martin Buber talk about in here to be like utterly simplistic? He says there's 2 kinds of relationships. An I-it relationship, where you treat somebody like an object. But if you really want to know them, if you really want to have insight into who they are, you need to, if you would, establish a spiritual connection, a real, genuine connection with a human being. And he calls this an I-thou relationship. An I-thou relationship says, I don't have power over you. You don't have power over me. We're in a partnership, and I am really listening to you, and you are really in a relationship to me. So for my dissertation, I was committed to that kind of a relationship. And the principle of partnership in contextual inquiry rebalances the power between the 2 people, pays attention to the power. It says that you are together facing their phenomena of their experience together. You are understanding, and the participant, we want to call them a participant. We're not subjecting them to something. We're asking them to participate in our research together to look at their life. And when we do that, they lead. They show us where we need to go, and that opens our mind. So that's our first principle. All right, now what? So here I am, I'm the researcher, I'm in relation to this person, but I'm also reading McMurray, another philosopher, and he is talking about that the self, who I am, is created in the between. The self is created in the relationships with other people. That how I am, now you know this, right? How I am in one relationship can be different than how I am in another relationship. Just like at a very kind of crazy level, my husband, who before he passed, I was with for 42 years. When we decorated the house, we had certain kinds of things that we liked. But Hugh Byer, who was my business partner for over 30 years, when we decorated the office, no, we had different things. Who we are is in relation to the other person. What does that mean? That means I'm impacting them, they're impacting me, and our reality is in the middle. Our reality is in the middle. Well, geez, if I impact them too much, I'm not getting their perception. My data is going to be crappy, right? My preconceived notions, my attitudes, what I'm going to bring in is going to kind of mess things up. But whereas experimental research says standardize your interaction, fine, that's fine for some questions, but it also creates an I-it relationship. We don't flex to the other person. Now, so what does a phenomenological research position tell us? It says if we're going to be in the relationship, we have to account for our influence. We have to be cognizant of our influence, and we have to make sure that we don't walk away with our made-up understanding of what is going on. And so the interpretation principle came from the phenomenological, if you would, most important idea that we must be accountable for our impact on any situation. And if we want to truly understand lives, this is people, it's not gravity, okay? If we want to understand lives, then we need to make sure that if we have an idea of what's going on, that we share that interpretation so they can respond. So the second principle, or the third really, is interpretation, and it comes from this notion of accounting for yourself. And the way I did that in my dissertation is I had to include how the lives of the participants affected my own friendship relationships, and back again, how it affected the research. So a phenomenological perspective says, I have to be accountable for me. I can't just walk in there. Yes? Okay. But remember, all of this is also done as far as product goes in the need to be sure that the data we say we collected is indeed a reflection of the lives of the people. And then that leads us to another book that was influential on me, which was Kuhn and the whole notion of paradigms, and the whole notion that, you know, whether we call it Piagetian assimilation or whether we just talk about paradigms we hang on to, the world is flat, and we wait and we wait and we wait and we wait until the data is so overwhelming, we have to come up with a new framework. We have to come up with a new way of understanding. And I was like, well, we can't wait for all that. We really can't. In the moment, if we want the data, we have to do deliberate paradigm shift. And that's what the principle of focus is all about. We can, on purpose, change our assumptions in order to let in the user's reality, right? Instead of our preconceived notion. People are always wanting to throw out data. That's the 1 in a million user. And I always say to them, what are the odds that you're talking to the 1 in a million user? And then they look, you know, kind of humble, and they go, oh, 1 in a million. I'm like, right. So let's go find out. And this focus principle says, look at your internal cues. If you're dismissing the user's data, their experience, their behavior, it says probe, go find out what's going on. You on purpose listen for the no's in their nonverbals. If you say, I'm thinking you're thinking this, and they go, some people would think that, that means no. It doesn't mean yes. So we have to be committed to the no's. We have to be committed to challenging our assumptions, and that our whole point in being there is to open our ideas. All of this leads to much more reliable claims of data claims, but it also says this is how you treat people. And the idea of how to treat people ethically continues on into how we deal with the data. We have a principle that says no gossip. Once you interview someone, not only do you never share their name, but you don't get to talk about them. You don't get to roll your eyes, because that's going to carry into your interpretation of the data, how you treat other people, etc. No gossip, no eye roll. So if we take a look at it, the contextual inquiry practice says, hey, this is how we treat people. We have to be accountable for our bias. We have to challenge our assumptions. And that's the way we're going to get the best data.